Alright, welcome to Rethinking Reality. We're continuing our study of George Berkeley's The Dialogues in order to understand the thought of Jonathan Edwards, since we're kind of leapfrogging from him into the other guy. And likewise, we're going to continue in the arguments in the dialogues, covering the different types of sensations and how Berkeley's arguing that they exist in the mind. Now, we have some new people here tonight, so I'm going to review a couple of concepts from the very beginning of the study for everybody's benefit. And just to be clear on what this study is about, it's about George Berkeley, who was a British empiricist, and he was also a bishop in the Anglican Church. And Jonathan Edwards, along with Berkeley, shared a very similar vision on the nature of reality. And they have presented many arguments that have been dismissed or overlooked over the years, and we're going to try to uncover and understand Edwards, because Berkeley's a lot clearer and Edwards is a lot more difficult, but Edwards has fixed a lot of problems that do exist in Berkeley, and their ideas are very relevant to issues in philosophy right now. Now, what their goals were in developing their philosophy was to be anti-skepticism. They were against the skeptics, those who denied the possibility of knowledge. They were against the atheists. In fact, they would believe that skepticism leads to atheism, which is often true, which is the denial of God. They wanted to establish with confidence the existence of an eternal soul, the existence of God, and they also wanted to reform science in a way that would keep it from leading to skepticism and atheism, which they believed that there was a certain specific issue that was arising in philosophy at the time that was a cause of this. Now, what they were attacking was matter, the existence of matter, and a position called realism. Now, I want to briefly discuss what matter is, because the way we often use it in the vulgar would be to refer to atoms, for instance. But what they meant by matter is not atoms. Neither were the philosophers that they were referring to. Rather, what matter was something that was self-sustaining. That means it was not dependent on anything else for its existence. A lot of times you might even have had in old science classes, I know I did, references to matter being can't be created or destroyed. It can't be destroyed, it's basic. Likewise, it's mind-independent, which is a second premise to the idea of matter, as it's philosophically defined, which means that it exists independent of anybody perceiving it, anybody's mind. It's also irreducibly basic, so it makes up everything. Everything that exists, whether it's our knowing process or values, the way our bodies work, the way something exists outside of us, everything can be reduced to a material explanation. Relationships out there. Likewise, it's philosophically fundamental. Now, this is similar to irreducibly basic, but with philosophically fundamental is everything has to come back down to the matter. So if, for instance, you want to say, I have an ethical belief, I believe certain things are wrong. Your beliefs, your values can be explained in material terms. Now, this is the same thing, similar to irreducibly basic. However, with philosophically fundamental, it is fundamental for every branch of philosophy. So if I were to say that, I use logical inferences in my knowledge, they would say that that was developed by, let's say, natural selection, through different chemical processes in the brain, through different genes that had survived because of natural selection, and you keep reducing that back down, you get back down to matter. Eventually, you'll have to say that even our knowledge, our ethics, everything that we do can be explained in terms of matter. So that is kind of fills up this whole definition, and now this is an old definition. However, most materialists, or oftentimes they'll use the term physicalist, because materialist is kind of antiquated, they'll refer themselves as a physicalist, but they'll accept this definition for their position. This is what they believe is fundamental in reality. Now, this is one of the things that Edwards and Berkeley are attacking. They say that will lead to skepticism and atheism. Realism, as a position, is the idea that the objects that cause our perception of them, like I'm perceiving a chair right now. Now, realism would say that the perception, the actual visual image I have, is independent of my mind. And so they would say that the object that exists independent of my mind is causing the image of chair into my mind, or the chair is directly presenting itself. So the mind-independent object, we're assuming it's a chair at this moment, either is or causes our perceptions. So, and that is another notion that is being attacked here as well. Berkeley and Edwards are saying that all things exist in created or uncreated consciousness. which would be referring to God and, of course, the minds of his creatures. And it's a very elaborate system, and we're just slowly starting to ease our way into it because it's very easy to get tripped up into some of the common misconceptions. I dealt with two misconceptions right away, knee-jerk reactions in our first study, in a way that was kind of humorous in that first study. I'll just briefly review them. The first one is the idea that, and there was an old limerick that was used to describe it, and I can't remember it offhand, I don't have my paper, but the idea was that God must find it quite odd when the quad ceases to be, when no one's about in it. The idea was that, okay, if I'm no longer in this room and I walk out, if everything's in the mind, as these guys are asserting, well then the room must disappear. So God must find it humorous that things disappear when people aren't looking at them. Now, of course, the response that people gave to this, that Berkeley would have given to this, would be, well, God would find that kind of ridiculous because he's always perceiving it. There's nothing outside of his knowledge. So the room doesn't disappear because when no one's there, he's perceiving it still. It still exists in his mind. Another objection that comes about with this whole idea is that the object isn't real. Okay, so if I say that the object exists only in a mind, is it there? And the idea that Berkeley's saying is no, it still has its sensible properties. It still has the solidarity, the visual, all the things that we view it with our senses. That's what makes it real. So, in fact, one person who was so outraged with Berkeley when he was coming over, told his servants, don't open the doors for him because he doesn't believe they're there. He'll walk right through them. And this was a criticism of Berkeley, saying, well, Berkeley doesn't believe that the objects are real. But that's no critique of Berkeley, because Berkeley's saying, no, they are solid. I can't walk through a door. It is its sensible qualities, but sensible qualities exist in the mind. And this is what we've been covering in the last couple of studies to help understand what Berkeley's position actually is. Now, that's a brief review of the study and its goals from the very get-go, is to understand what Berkeley actually believes. Now, in our last study, last week, we covered a couple sensations. We had already gone through a few, but the ones we covered last week were tastes, smells, and sounds. Now, he plays out three different arguments, and just to briefly summarize, when it comes to tastes and smells, one of the arguments he uses is the relativity argument. So, for instance, to use taste, now, one person tastes, let's say, wedding cake, and they get pleasure from the cake. So, it tastes good, it's sweet, and it's an enjoyable thing. Another person tastes that same exact cake, but they get it's uncomfortable, makes them sick, it's disgusting because it's too sweet, like I would say. That's my perception of most wedding cakes. Now, if, as some people have argued, the realists said that the sensation, which is identical with, okay, my reaction to it, so sweetness is a pleasure, bitterness would say, let's say, be a pain. If it's actually in the object, it should be identical for both of us, if it's in the object. But however, me and someone else would disagree on that cake. Now, that's the relativity argument. Now, he's used it for other sensations as well. But another argument is that identity argument. And this one can be exemplified using lemon juice and orange juice. Now, I drink cup of orange juice and I get like a subtle sweetness. I drink a little bit of lemon juice and I get that tartness. Well, then I go to drink that orange juice a second time after drinking the lemon juice. Now it's really sweet. Now the first time it was mildly sweet. Now the second time I tasted it after the lemon juice, now it was like almost sickeningly sweet. Now, if sweetness was in the object, that is, the object had its set standard of sweetness within it, okay, the sensation, not like a level of sugar measured, but actually the actual feeling, the sensation of sweetness. If it were in the object, it would not change with the circumstances, but rather it did, because I experienced something else and it affected how that other sensation was to me. So, but if it was in the object, if the feeling was in the object, that would be a problem. And going to sounds, that's the relativity argument and the identity argument. The reason that issue is so big is if something's super sweet and sweet at the same time, it's the same thing with taking water. Now, the reason it's called identity argument is because the law of identity, the law of logic, A is not non-A, says that something cannot be its opposite at the same time. So, for instance, if you take water, and we'll say that the temperature we designated at is 65 degrees. If you put one hand that you had by a heater and one hand that you had outside in that water, one hand will perceive the water to feel kind of warm because your hand was cold. The other hand that was by the heater, in that same water, will say the water feels cold. Now, if the feeling of heat or cold was actually in the water itself, communicating to your mind, then you wouldn't have a contradiction, but you do. Now, if the sensation was in the water, actually the water itself was the feeling, then it would be one feeling no matter what your hands were doing. You put it in that water, it would communicate what it was to you. However, the determining factor was you, not the water. So the feeling is not in the water, it was in the mind. This is the identity principle, and the reason is because something cannot be its opposite at the same time. But that simple experiment that all of us are familiar to with experience dictates that that would be a contradiction. There's a problem there. Another argument that came up with sounds was one that I often repeat. Now, I use what's called the qualia argument to describe it, which is in philosophy of mind, it's more contemporary, but it describes what Berkeley was arguing. Hylas, who is the person that Berkeley is responding to through Philinus in the book, argues that, well, sound is really vibrations in the air that affect the eardrum, that affect nerves in your brain, and then that creates the sound that you hear. But the real sound is the motions in the air. Now, Philinus picks fun at Hylas over this because Hylas is basically saying that real sound has no sound. And, of course, Hylas says, well, I know how dumb it sounds, but that's the way it is. Now, the reason that the argument is ridiculous is because we're talking about the sensation of sound. Where is it located? Now, what the qualia argument says that, and the example that I used before was, if you have Joe, who was born, never heard music or heard any sounds in his life. You put him in a room, he was born in that room, and there's no music playing, there's no noises, and he wants to study and get a comprehensive knowledge of the experience of music. Now, what he does is he watches orchestras on video. He watches diagrams about wavelengths in the air of sound, movement in the air, the nature of the eardrum, the nervous system, and the brain, and he even watches testimonies with like subtitles, no sounds involved. Now, scientifically, he believes he has a comprehensive knowledge of what it is to hear something. All right, I understand the ear, I understand its process, I understand the brain processes involved, I understand the vibrations in the air, resonation, I understand all these concepts, I can even read music. But then he steps out of that room, and for the first time he hears music playing. Has he learned something new? Now, what this argument demonstrates is that the motions in the air that Hylas was appealing to isn't really sound. Sound is the experience of hearing something. So it was absurd for Hylas to say, well, no, real sound is just emotion in the air, vibrations. It's not, and it causes the hearing in our mind. Now this comes down to this next point here from our last study. It's called the come-hock fallacy. Now, it's only being subtly introduced right now by Berkeley through Philinus. But what it says is that a correlation does not imply causation. Just because I can see or feel vibrations, and then in response to that I have the hearing, does not mean that the vibrations cause the hearing. It's just the moment when they happen to occur together. And another example that we had with heat and with a pin demonstrated this example even more clearly. For instance, pain is experienced by somebody. So if a pin pricks my finger, is pain in the pin? No, pain is in me. When the pin was tearing open my flesh, that occasioned the feeling of pain in me. Similarly, if extreme heat is indistinguishable from pain, which Berkeley had established, so you put your hand immediately into boiling water. You're not sitting there saying, oh wow, that's hot. Oh, wow, that hurts. No, it's instant. Your hand's back, it hurts. And that the sensations are indistinguishable. Now, is it appropriate to say that pain is in the water? No, it's not. Okay? What's in the water is often said to be extreme heat, but extreme heat is indistinguishable from pain, so therefore extreme heat is not in the water either. Because pain's not in the water, so neither is extreme heat. It's in the mind. So, but what happens when you put your hand in boiling water is similar to what happens when you put a pin in your finger. There's damage done to your body, and at that time, when that occurs, when you see that happen, you also simultaneously get a pain. Doesn't mean that the water caused the pain. It just happens to be the case that when your flesh gets damaged, pain arises. Now, he hasn't explained why yet, and it's not the point. The reason is he's attacking Hylas because he's making an error in logic. Similar for someone who would say that just because all countries that don't have apple trees have high Islamic population, it's false to say that, well, the reason high Islamic populations arise is because there's no apple trees. That's a correlation. Yes, it might be the case that where there's no apple trees, there's lots of Muslims. That doesn't mean that having no apple trees will cause Muslim population. That's an error in reasoning. But they're using the same thing with something that's even more difficult to discern. When a pin damages the flesh, is it the cause of pain? Or is it the moment that pain happens to arise? Now, to say it causes it, it would be actually do the same exact fallacy. Did it cause it, or is it the occasion in which it arises? There's a distinction. So that's what we covered in our last study, some of the issues that Berkeley's kind of introducing. And tonight we're going to be getting into the end of a certain category of sensation and into a new one. And so I want to briefly review one of the guys that influenced Berkeley, who also influenced Edwards. Edwards responded a lot to the same individual. The man was John Locke. Now, John Locke makes a distinction between what's called primary and secondary qualities. What they are is, a primary quality is mass, extension, which would be like the dimension of an object, shape, the way it appears, as far as like the angles and whatnot, and of course motion, the movement that you perceive. These are what we call primary. Now, secondary qualities we've dealt with already in the studies, and we'll be doing the last one tonight. And we'll be talking about that's taste, color, the feeling, the odor. Those things are secondary qualities. Now, so far, Berkeley has demonstrated that with these sensations that we've covered so far, which are all secondary qualities, that they exist in the mind. But John Locke would actually concede that. He would say that those sensations do exist in the mind. However, primary qualities don't. So even though taste, color, odor, those things can be said to be in the mind, caused by an object, mass, extension, shape, those things must be the mind-independent part. So there's something out there that has mass, extension, motion, shape, and then it causes sensations in my mind that are taste, odor, etc. And there's a distinction he tries to make. Now, John Locke didn't invent this, but he really brought it back to the forefront in philosophy. Now, Berkeley is going to attack this distinction. He's going to say, no, this and this are both in the mind. In fact, in many ways, you can't really distinguish the two. I mean, how can you know extension without perceiving it? And, perceptions are usually only understood in terms of color and etc. But he's going to get into a more precise argument in dealing with this tonight, in a humorous way, of course. And it's going to be really interesting to get into, and let's get to the reading. All right, we're back. We just got done reading from the dialogues again, and we covered two different types of sensible qualities. Can anybody tell me the two that we covered?
Colors.
Yeah, that's one.
Extension.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think I had that written down, actually. Cheated. All right. Well, okay. Well, which one? Can you tell me which one is the primary, which one's the secondary?
Colors.
Is what?
Colors is secondary. Extension's
Okay.
primary. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what is Hylas's contention on the distinction? So what's he saying is difference between the two? And why does that matter for his purpose?
Colors is in the mind, and that the extension is in the object.
Okay, so is extension the only type of primary quality?
No.
Well,
What other things are primary?
Motion.
mass, right?
He says it. There's a list.
I think the
Figure, solidarity, gravity,
Why does
rest.
now? Why is he just making this up, or is he appealing to other sources in this?
Well, yeah, he says other philosophers, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
this is what Berkeley's way of getting at Locke, so to address him through the book. So Hylas's contention is that, okay, well, even if I concede this type of sensible quality, like colors, taste, things like that, I'll concede those are in the mind, because other philosophers have done that much, but they're still in mind-independent objects, because they have to have these other type of qualities. Now, he goes through two different arguments in demonstrating that the different things exist in the mind. Now there's 2 for each. Now for colors, he uses 2 arguments. Which is the first argument that he uses?
It was about the clouds.
Oh, yeah.
It's along that lines. Okay.
So the distance, the color changes from the distance, or how the near, because he said that farther away person will see one color.
Why does this criticism matter? What's Hylas's position?
That it's in the
Yeah, the color's in the object. So when you see clouds on a sunset being red, is redness in the cloud?
Yeah.
Because he says when you get up close enough, it'll just be like a mist. You won't see redness in it anymore. It's from the distance, because later you'll see the second argument. So what's the second argument? Second argument is a response. Light. Okay, you're right. It's about light, because that's Hylas saying, okay, you're right. So when I go up close to an object, that redness disappears, so it's apparent. But the reason that all these appearances are there is because of light. So color is actually in light, not in the object. So, and even in modern science, we would say that the colors we perceive are what's given off of the object. That's why they would say, for instance, like grass wouldn't grow as good under a green light, they would say, because the grass reflects greenness to us for our perception. So they would say color is in the light. Now, this is sort of Hylas is already holding to this position. Now, what is the argument that finalist uses against this?
Is it a microscope?
Against which part?
Against the idea that light is color.
Well, he says that it changes.
It's similar to an argument he did in the last.
Well, he was saying
study.
like in the case of jaundice, that everyone sees everything as yellow. That different things would see things different color. Different animals would see the colors, same object in a different color.
Yeah, that's true. But here's to give it a kind of a summary, specifically on the idea of light touching the optic nerve and affecting the brain. It was similar to what sensation last week that we discussed. What sensation was Hylas doing the exact same? Sound. Exactly. So he was saying that motions in the air were hitting the eardrum, hitting some nerves, causing the sensation of hearing. So that argument, so the first argument, just to give them away now, to cover them, first argument he deals with is the identity argument. Again, and he's using the qualia argument. Now, the reason he's using the identity argument, okay, so you say you have an appearance, okay? Now, if the color is in the object, okay, so let's say, and now this is where he uses the microscope example. So if this chair appears to be brown at this plain distance that I have, and I put a microscope to it, and let's say there's something in the wood that when you go with a microscope, there's like a purplish hue. If that be the case, what is the object really? Is it really brown, or is it really that purplish hue? Now, the identity principle says that A cannot be non-A. It's a principle of logic. Okay, it's an absolute. This is the principle of absurdity. If an object can't be two contradictory things, can it be red and blue in the exact same way at the exact same time? Now, if you put a microscope to this object, is it really that image, or is it the former? That's sort of the question that's being brought up here. So that's the first argument. So it's similar with cloud. Is redness in the cloud? Is the cloud red, or is it that dark shadowy mist when you get closer? Which is it? Which is the cloud? If the color is in the cloud, it would have to be one or the other. Couldn't be both. It'd be
Hylas would say that it was the closest. That's what Hylas argued.
Yeah,
you're right. So they get into the microscopic stuff. But now, once again, you get into the microscopic. Now you have that conflict between common sense and how far can you go into perception? Because you can only go so far with the microscopes they had at the time, and that we even have now. You get so far, which one's the real color? Remember, is color in the object? And so you have, at all different levels, different colors. And you can just go ad infinitum. So how far into the object can you go before you get to the real color? Okay, likewise, he does the same thing. He brings into the relativity principle different animals with different types of eyes look at the same object. Well, it's common to say that, let's say, dogs see black and white, or cows or different types of animals. Okay, whose perception of the object is correct? Which object is the right color? Is the object really black and white? Is the dog correct? Or am I correct to say that it's brown and green? Or perhaps a bee that's said to see in an ultraviolet spectrum. If the color is in the object, which animal's correct? What color is the object? Is it ultraviolet and the colors I perceive? Or is it just black and white? Bee, dog, or man? You have an issue here.
Wow.
If color's in the object and it's presenting itself to minds, it would be one fixed color to all who perceive it, but it's not. Who's right? And that's sort of the question here. Now that argument's called the relativity argument, and I'll bring that up because it's going to be more prevalently used in this one. But the relativity argument says, okay, if it's in the object, we would all see it alike. The identity argument is saying that, okay, well, if I perceive an object with a microscope or from a distance or whatever, it should be the same no matter what. It should be fixed. But no, there's different perceptions of that object. Similarly, the same object, whether it's in candlelight or in broad daylight, its appearance will be different. Now, if it's in the object, the color shouldn't change. It should be fixed. It should be presenting itself to me if it's independent of my perceiving it. That's the kind of the dispute. Now, the light argument, now this is going right back to the Quayle argument. I covered last week that this isn't, I'm using an argument from the philosophy of mind developed by Frank Jackson to describe what Berkeley's doing. Now, it's used in two different ways. The way that Frank Jackson used it is to show that consciousness, which is the mind, the feature of awareness, cannot be explained through the physical. It's something not physical. Human consciousness cannot be explained by observing brain waves, things in nature. It's actually the experience of something. It's subjective. But Berkeley's using it that way, and he's also using it to show that sensations you can't divorce it from personal experience. So, in this case, with light, okay, Hylas is saying, okay, color is light. That's real color. It's the waves, the particles of matter coming into my eyeball, hitting the nerve, sending a signal to my brain, which leads to that sensation of, redness. Okay? So the reality, the real color, is in light. So, but once again, the same objection with sound. Hylas is basically saying, real color has no color. Because the light is independent of my mind. It affects or causes color in my mind. So real color, which is just waves out there, or particles moving, it has no color itself. It's not perceived. It affects my mind and creates the sensation. Now, once again, this is actually, to use the actual original Quayle argument finally, Mary in the red room. Mary in the red hallway, I think, is actually how it's supposed to go. Anyway, so you have Mary. She's a scientist studying color. Now, she has been, in her whole life, in a black and white room, never seen any colors other than, of course, the black and white in her room. Now, she wants to understand the color redness, what it means to experience or understand redness, the sensation of redness. She wants to know this. She wants to have a comprehensive understanding. So what she does is she observes people on a screen, black and white screen, giving testimonies of what it's like to see these colors. Likewise, she studies wavelengths of light on different machines and gadgets that she has in her room, understanding what wavelengths produce what aforementioned color. Okay, there's little titles. She'll see a wavelength, say, this is the red spectrum, violet, whatever, all on black and white screen. Likewise, she sees, brain scans and different things that show how the brain reacts when people claim to see the color. You'll see certain parts of the different cortexes or whatever lighting up, synapses firing, different reactions. You'll see different things in the retina, opening and closing. She analyzes all this information. She feels she has a comprehensive knowledge. Now, this is Hylas's point. Okay, the light is the color. That's the real deal. That's where it's at. Now, Mary has the same understanding Hylas is arguing for here. She's observed and explained and analyzed light, testimonies, brain waves, the optic nerves, the retina, you name it, she studied it. She leaves that room for the first time in her life into the hallway, and it's bright red. She sees red for the first time. Just like with the other example I used earlier in our review, has she learned something new?
Definitely.
Okay, so redness cannot be explained by looking at wavelengths of light. or looking at synapses firing in the brain, or movement in the retina, or in particles affecting the eye, as Hylas is arguing. No doubt there's light, there's something that touches our eye that we can feel. We can feel the heat on our face from the sun, and then we can see the blinding whiteness when we look at it. All right? But, once again, it's the occasion at which that sensation occurs, but it would be false to say that it is the cause or the source or the origin of that sensation. Because you can analyze light all you want, but unless you actually see color, you won't understand it. Just like you can observe and feel. You can feel vibrations. You can observe screens with vibrations. Doesn't mean you understand what the sound of music is until you actually experience it. The experience is subjective, and analyzing these other types of experiences isn't going to give you knowledge of that experience in particular. So, looking at light isn't going to give you, like on a screen, isn't going to give you experience of color if you're in a black and white room. You're not until you see the color. So this is what's called the qualia argument, or the knowledge argument in philosophy of mind, and this is sort of what Berkeley is using here. Now, in extension, we also have two arguments. Can anybody outline those?
Distance.
Well, just
Do we have to do it as the official term? Because it was like the distance, because he said comparing
Well, what's the first one?
the extension.
He uses what as an example?
Was it the mite first?
Yep.
He says that, what a mite's foot looks like to us, and what the mite sees his own foot, and something smaller than the mite sees the mite's foot.
Did anyone else understand that example?
That
do
to
you mean, sorry?
us, its foot's super tiny, and that to the mite, it's
Okay, he said
bigger, and then to something smaller than the mite, it would be a mountain.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why is that relevant?
Because it's the same thing, it didn't change.
Why does that matter?
Well, because to us to the mite it appears to be bigger, and to us it appears to be smaller. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea.
So when the mite observes the when the mite observes, is it a foot?
Yeah.
Yeah. When mite observes his own foot, he sees it as, normal.
Mm-hmm.
But when we observe the mite's foot, it appears to be very small.
Yeah, like a speckle.
To something
So how-
less than the mite, it would seem larger.
So then how could extension be? How could it be the same? How could there be the same?
You're right, because there was no change in the object. So let's
Yeah.
say, to give a more concrete example away from the book, okay, I have this crayon in my hand. Okay, now without any change in the object, okay, remember we're always talking about sensations and perceptions here. This is Berkeley's whole thesis. Okay, the way a fly perceives this crayon and the way I do are differently. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if there was no change in the object, and the object is where extension lies, the perception or the sensation of extension, then why is it different for both of us? Wouldn't it be the same? If it was in the object and it was fixed, there was no change in the object. But for the fly, and for me, it's different. It's different. Now, this is what would be... Now, he did cover this up here when he was talking about animals have different eyes and therefore have different sensations of color. But it's called I call it the relativity argument, which is that you take one fixed object, or the one that we call fixed, and two different beings perceive it to be different.
Yeah.
Similar for people that, and this was brought up with taste, who can go to taste an object, one person loves it, another person hates it.
Mm-hmm.
But if the enjoyment that I got from it was really in the substance, like, there's a perfect harmony of sweet and sour in that chicken. If that harmony that I experienced, that's so pleasurable, was really in the object, then all would agree. But we don't. Similarly, in a much more extreme manner, if extension is in the object, then when this crayon is observed by a fly, it doesn't look gigantic. Whereas to me, it looks very small. Now, that's the relativity argument. Now, what is the second argument?
It says as we approach to or recede from an object, the visible extensions varies.
There's one already listed here that's the same
Identity.
identity argument.
Identity argument. Okay.
Right. Now, what do you guys think about this argument? Is it a good argument?
Well, the object didn't change, but it can go from being,
But the perception changes.
yeah.
Okay, the object didn't change. At least this is, of course, the alleged part of this is the assumption they're both agreeing on. So, let's say, I do this every day when I go to work. I go through the Pittsburgh skyline. So I perceive the buildings as I'm going close.
Yeah.
Now, I can take my hand, I'm driving on my windshield, and I can do like this. The whole building I can fit in my hand like this. I can see it as I'm approaching it. Now, when I get close, and I'm getting ready to cross the Fort Pitt Bridge, the building is huge. Like, I can't even fill my whole sight with it while driving without wrecking into something. Now, the object hasn't changed. Most people would say that nothing's changed in the building. However, the visual perception has changed. The visual perception. Now, remember, this is the point. With realism, it's saying that the perception, the vision that I'm getting, okay, the image in my mind that I'm getting is coming from the object. It's in the object. Now, this is the part that Hylas is holding, saying extension is in the object itself. It's fixed. That's where it's at. Extension is mind independent. If that be the case and there was no change in the object, why was there a change in my perception? He's trying to say that they're together like this. They're interwoven. The image I have is in the object itself. Object doesn't change, perception changes, you have a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
If the object didn't change, then why did the perception change? That's not a problem for Berkeley, for Philinus, it's a problem for Hylas. Because he's saying, and this is the principle of absurdity he brings up, can the same object have two different dimensions, or two different extensions? One small and one ginormous.
Yeah.
Of course not. It's ridiculous to assert that. It's incomprehensible that an object be minuscule and ginormous at the same time. That's exactly the point. That building that I perceive is small and large, perceptually, as I see it. No change in the object, but a change in my perception. So, is the perceiving of extension in the object? That's the point. To say that it is, you violate identity. Because if it's in the object, it can't be small and big at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the issue that you come across with visual perception. So, is the image I have in my mind in the object, or is the image I have of that object in my mind? That's the point. That's the question that's being brought up here. And it's a very essential question. Questions?
How are the relativity argument and the identity argument? So just explain how are they different?
Relativity argument is different individuals. So,
Okay.
make a cake here.
Nice.
Okay.
Hungry.
Okay. Person J perceives cake. Person K perceives the cake. But they perceive it differently.
Yeah.
Okay? So, if it's in the object, they should perceive it the same, but they don't.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the relativity argument. Okay? The identity argument,
Is A does not equals.
well, let me explain this here.
Okay.
There's only one person.
Okay.
The identity argument is that one person can perceive in the one object, one person, two different things going on. Okay? So, now in regards to extension, when he perceives the object, he can perceive it, like with me going to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Okay? I perceive it as large and small, the same building.
Okay.
Violation of identity.
Okay.
All right. Same thing would occur with water at an intermediate state. This is actually the example that Philinus brings back up.
Okay.
All right, to remind Hylas about how, okay, you thought it was absurd in one example, you have to maintain that with this example as well. In a like case, it should still apply.
They're both kind of dealing with the same.
Yeah, they are. They are.
Same thing.
Well, because they're attacking the same
Mm-hmm.
issue. The issue is, the one issue is the sensation in the object? He's using different arguments to get to that. Okay, this argument says that the sensation is in the object because if it were in the object, then all would experience it alike.
Mm-hmm.
This one is saying that if it was in the object, it couldn't contradict its own nature when one person was perceiving it. Just like one person puts his hands, one hand that's hot, one hand that's cold, in the same water, the hands have contradictory sensations. If the sensation was in the water, you wouldn't have a contradiction. You can't violate the law of logic.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case here, where the two people are perceiving the cake, they're having a different experience of the cake, but they're two different individuals. So why I call it relativity is that the experience is relative to the different individuals. Where in this case, there's only one individual.
Gotcha. All right.
Any other questions? We got a new guy, quiet.
No, that question, that really helped a lot in terms of differentiating the relativity versus the identity arguments.
Any objections? Off the cuff. No objections or criticisms, like with what Berkeley's doing, trying to do, what he's getting at. Well, great.
Well,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I guess I could.
Yeah, for some.
Couldn't you say that? I mean, with the relativity argument, right?
Mhm.
Couldn't you say that the object is what it is, and one person views it as, like J views it as what it is, and K, because he's different, views it as something else.
Okay, so that there would be some sort of but here's the
Views it as not
Okay.
something.
You're
not,
saying
not
the
that,
people are different, but
not
the
that,
object's
not
not
that he
different.
views it as something else, but views it as something that's not. I mean, views it as something. Views it.
I understand where you're
Using
coming
it
from.
correctly?
Yes.
So he has a false sense
Yeah,
of reality.
yeah. Views
Okay.
it correctly.
Okay,
Exactly.
well,
Yeah.
we always have to keep in mind the point that Berkeley's making is that the object, the realists, the ones that he's criticizing,
Yeah.
are trying to say that the object will present itself the same to all people who are perceiving it.
Mhm.
Okay, now if we say that, okay, that's the case, the one person's really messed up. Right? He's like, you know,
Yeah.
he's totally not looking at that object
Yeah.
correctly. There's something wrong with his ability
Yeah.
to look at it. Now, the question is that what criteria do we have to say that there's a hindrance? Like, for instance, we brought this up with color blindness.
Mhm.
Okay, you could have, how do you determine that someone's colorblind and they have a false perception? Now, of course, when it comes to where the perceptions come from, that we'll get to later with Berkeley and Edwards, you know, God is the cause of perceptions. He's the cause of color blindness in some people. He's withheld some of his revelation to them. Now, what is the situation here, though, is how you determine that someone has a bad perception and others have good. And I think this is actually part of the problem with the relativity example that's good, is that we don't always have a criteria. Okay, so if it's just me and you debating over a piece of cake, all right, well, that cake was good.
Yeah.
Well, that cake's too sweet.
Mhm.
Who's right? What criteria do you have to determine that? None whatsoever?
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Not really.
Well, we can measure sugar, but
Uh-huh.
you like 2 teaspoons, I like 10. Doesn't help. It doesn't help. The idea is that associating that experience of pleasure or discomfort with the experience of the cake, if it's in the cake, it shouldn't matter that we disagree.
Mhm.
And so for you to say that I'm wrong and you're right, you have to develop a criteria of determining that.
Mhm.
But how would you do that anyway? And likewise, unless it was something extremely significant, like your tongue's cut out, you know, that would be an occasion in which there's a change. You'd still have to ask is, if it's in the object itself, what does it matter if there's something wrong with me? Shouldn't it be presenting itself, its character to me? You know, what hurdles would it have to get through? And I think it depends. So it's the same thing with with altering your hand. Okay, you have one hand hot, one hand cold, and you put it in the same water. Okay, in that example, okay, is it which hand is correct?
So wait, so materialists see the object as you say, like present it to your as it the object presents itself to us.
Mm-hmm.
So the object is a force.
Well, presentational realism is saying that when I perceive the object, I'm perceiving it as it is. There's no mediation between me and the object. Okay, you see what I'm saying? There's nothing standing between me as far as knowledge, in epistemology, between me and the object.
Mm-hmm.
So it's directly, and that's why the word present is the only way it's really to really grasp that
Mm-hmm.
concept. When you're talking in these type of philosophical terms, there's really no better way of getting to it. I don't mean that the object has an action in which it does that, but it's the best way of expressing what is meant. That is, my eyes are open, and the object is there, and it's directly there. Because there's other types of realism. There is representational realism, which would say that the image I have of the chair is a representation of the chair behind the image.
Yeah.
So there's a chair that's out there,
Mm-hmm.
and then the image I have is a representation of that chair, but I don't really see the chair as it is.
Okay.
See the difference?
Okay.
So, and then like Immanuel Kant would say, that we have sensations coming in, and our mind forms the image in our head, and the sensations come from out there, but we have no idea from where or what they represent.
Mm-hmm.
The mind creates the chair, and the sensations come from out, but we don't know from where, why, how, what's out there. We never know what's out there. That's why his criticisms of God and the nature of reality were so strong, because he said that we can't know what's out there. We can only know the content of our own mind, which is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different from Berkeley's view. Now, with those two different views, what Berkeley's addressing here is saying that, okay, you're saying that it's in the object, and the perception, the visual image is in the object itself, presenting itself to me. If that is the case, and nothing's changed in the object that I can tell, then why has my image or my visual perception changed? If it's identical with the object itself and it hasn't changed.
That's the identity argument, right?
That's the identity argument, but in the relativity argument, it's doing a similar thing as identity argument, only from different perspectives. So, if the identity is in the object, it should be the same for all perceivers.
Would you say identity argument is stronger?
It is stronger.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay.
I would say that the relativity argument is okay, but once again, you can get into problems, okay? Yours is the closest, I think, to a valid objection in that you're saying, okay, well, something might be wrong with the other guy.
Uh-huh.
All right. However, once again, unless there is a clear and distinct malformity, what criteria do you have for judging? And I think in even stronger cases, when he brings in animals, is the bee's perception of a chair with an ultraviolet spectrum, a dog's black and white, or me with the spectrum that I have, whose perception is correct of those three.
Yeah.
Now, you can't point to malformity there.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have three
Different.
totally different ways of perceiving. So, whose perception is correct then? If it's in the object, and that's sort of the situation that you get. You don't have a criteria. So the relativity argument stands in that it's stating that if it's in the object itself, all perceptions will be identical.
Wouldn't argument there be like the being that's able to make his perception known or state his perception? Because
Well, that'd be like saying that, okay, I have a person in the room who's mute, all right, and so you have two people that see a murder, all right. Now, okay.
But he could write down he could write down.
Oh, well, okay. Well, we can just bring
or
that.
draw it.
We can break it down as far as we can go. We can have we can have a person who can see, who had his hands chopped off and is mute. All right. Okay. You have two people see a crime. Now one can communicate. Let's say the person who has his hands chopped off and is mute, okay, saw the murder happen in a more accurate light than the person who can't speak. The person who can speak can tell him all day long about what he saw and how he saw it. But if he, had a bad angle and didn't really see it as that other person did, that doesn't make his position any more valid just because he can communicate it.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that a human's perception is any more valid than the bee's, just because the bee can't communicate it. So that's my only, I guess, rebuttal to that.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
But once again, I don't think the relativity argument is nearly as strong as the identity argument. I would concede that, and I think Berkeley would too. Because anytime he brings in the relativity argument, he throws right into the identity, and then he gets into the qualia argument. He compounds his case, and that's really good for him because he wants to try to cover it from all angles. It's like layers of cement. He wants to push him into the hole, cover him in dirt, cement over the dirt, and then plant a tree on top or something. He wants to put this to rest, and he's going to do it with layers, working from the weakest to the strongest argument. And if the weakest argument trips him up, how much more then when he comes back once he's on the ground with a sledgehammer?
Yeah.
That's the idea. He's really building his case. And now these arguments, like I said, are repetition from the last study. But as we go, and once he really gets this hammered into Hylas's head, we're going to start getting into the different types of realism. You get into representational realism, the different theories that are dangerous. And then you'll get into questions about, okay, well, what causes our perceptions then, if it's not matter? Then the question about God, the soul, the nature of the universe, things like that. Skepticism, am I the only mind? You get into some real cool stuff. So we're still on the very tip here, and we're going down into the deeps. And then once we do that, we'll get to better understand Edwards and be able to study him more once we get the more simpler stuff out of the way. And Edwards has arguments that are relevant to apologetical conflicts right now within Christian circles, issues relevant to the philosophy of mind, which is the most fertile ground for debate over anything right now in philosophy. Very interesting stuff. And the ideas that Edwards and Berkeley had are arguably the most dismissed, misunderstood, and underrated views that I think the world has ever seen. And they were from the same time period, reacting to the same men, defending the same position, and they created a comprehensive philosophy to say, hey, this is the Reformation Christian response to what's going on right now in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And I think that this study is going to be helpful in getting there. So it was a good study. See you guys hopefully next week. See if we have a baby yet. Good night.